All right, I think we're going to begin. So this promises to be the spiciest of this year's ACPA sessions. So I'm glad that all of you are here. And so without further ado, we're going to have Tom Pink, then Alan Fimister, and then Tyler and I respond to Kevin Vallier's recent book, All the Kingdoms of the World. So we'll begin.
Thanks. Well, very briefly, because we don't have much time, I'm very interested in Kevin's book. There are areas where we are not in disagreement. There are areas where we have particular disagreements. There's one area where I think we have very different views, and that's in the issues to do with jurisdiction and legal authority to do with baptism. So I'm going to try and locate our views and try and give some sort of solution to the problems he raises from my own point of view. What is integralism? I take it to be the teaching of Leo XIII. First, that there are on this earth two potestates, two sovereign authorities that can impose legal obligations and enforce them with punishments. The church is potestas for religion on this earth, as the state is potestas for the civil order. And second, the state should recognize the church as potestas for religion as the supreme good. And given that her people depend for their supreme happiness on religion, should be prepared to direct legally for specifically religious ends to support religion as the supreme good. This could, for example, be to raise taxes to support children's education in the faith, specifically because the faith is true. But because the church alone has sovereign authority over religion, this legislation for religious ends in support of religious truth requires the authority of the church. So church and state cooperate where religion is concerned under the authority of the church for the good of the population that they share, including the supreme good of their people's salvation. This is a proper ordering of church and state as potestates in that it best enables them to cooperate to fulfill their shared function, which is surely ensuring the happiness of the people subject to their authority. I mean, I think that's basically Leo XIII's argument. Now, Vallier raises very interesting difficulties over the very idea of the church as a potestas, or so I think. And of course, if that goes, this whole apparatus collapses. So it's absolutely key that the church be a potestas. The church supposedly has a jurisdiction based on baptism. And it appears both that she cannot coerce those outside her jurisdiction, the unbaptized, into the faith, but she can coerce those already within her jurisdiction, the baptized, to remain. For Vallier, this is a strange mixture of liberalism for the unbaptized and illiberalism for the baptized. But is this so strange? At the political level, states generally cannot legally coerce people outside their jurisdiction, but they can coercively direct people once they are within their jurisdiction, and especially when under pressure, states can even coercively direct those within their jurisdiction not to leave. Consider Ukraine. So what's the difference? Well, actually, I think there is indeed an important difference, and I think Vallier is raising an important problem. One can, even as an adult, come to fall under the jurisdiction of a state entirely without one's consent. A treaty is signed to transfer your territory, and you pass into a new state jurisdiction without your consent. This can legitimately happen, but one cannot, as an adult, fall under the church's jurisdiction without one's consent. One's uncoerced acceptance of the faith is required. So by contrast, infants can be baptized without their consent, and they can then be bound by baptismal obligations thereafter. It seems then there's an important consent requirement to entering ecclesial jurisdiction that lacks political parallel, but for adults, not infants. So why should this be so? Is this just too peculiar to involve a genuine form of jurisdiction? This is just wacko, so the church can't be a potestas. To resolve this one way or another, I think we really do need a theory of legal authority and jurisdiction to see what possible forms they can take. And here I think there is an important lack in Vallier. Vallier does not actually provide a worked out anti-integralist theory of legal authority. But this is going to be crucial. An original opponent of the idea of the church as a potestas, Thomas Hobbes, as we shall see, did provide just such a theory, and a very brilliant one. Vallier says his case against the church as potestas says nothing about the legal direction of belief itself, because he claims even integralists concede that the direct legal coercion of belief is not possible. Belief is a truth-directed attitude, but orders or commands just to believe something are in themselves irrelevant to truth, as are threats of punishment. So belief itself can't be commanded. I can't just order you to believe that the Battle of Hastings took place in 1065. Vallier claims even integralists concede that there's only room for regulation of voluntary actions, actions that are subject to will and command. That does include voluntary actions that might influence belief, like I might use legal direction to induce you to believe something by legally directing you to go and look at convincing evidence, which would then lead you to form the belief. But the belief itself is not voluntary or formable to command. So you can coerce belief indirectly, but not directly. But this is to get the integralist understanding of legal direction very badly wrong. The canon law of the church, this legal system of the potestas, so it seems, does provide for legal direction of belief itself. That's what magisterial teaching involves. The church not only teaches you that something is the case, but imposes a canonical legal obligation on you to believe it. This is an obligation specifically to believe, not an obligation to perform further voluntary actions that might somehow indirectly get you to believe. Hobbes thought that the church's claim to be a potestas for religion over the baptized was absurd and dangerous, but also clearly recognized that a supposed legal direction of belief was essential to the functioning of her supposed legal authority, and rightly focused his critique of the church's potestas specifically on her alleged legal direction of belief. The jurisdiction of the church, if it is a genuine jurisdiction belonging to a genuine potestas, is surely at the service of faith. And then a central exercise of that jurisdiction, if there really is such a thing as an ecclesial jurisdiction, is going to be the legal direction of belief itself. If belief cannot be legally directed, the church's claim to be a potestas for faith is empty. So Hobbes is running a really serious line of attack. Hobbes, as I said, had a theory of legal authority to support his attack on the legal direction of belief. In Leviathan, legal authority is, as we would now say, coordinatory. It solves coordination problems. We all want security in life and property, transport, education, welfare. But provision of all these goods is so dependent on complex and burdensome cooperation as to give rise to serious coordination problems. You know, who's going to do this task? Who's going to do that? To solve these, we need legal authority to determine cooperation and to deter free riding. We need the directive decision of authority to resolve the problem of how we are to cooperate, and we await this needed direction, being motivated and willing, within limits, to act however we are legally directed, drive on the left rather than the right, or whatever, pay tax at this rate rather than that rate. But then legal direction really is only of the voluntary, of what we can do or refrain from doing at will, just because we have been directed so to do. And belief, central to religion, as we have seen, not voluntary in that way. Legal authority, with its enforcing threats of sanction, is one vast coordinative mechanism for ensuring satisfaction of widely shared desire. The church, essentially a teacher and former of beliefs, is plainly not that, so she is not a potestas. It's the Hobbesian argument. This model of legal authority as coordinative, as serving to resolve coordination problems, has been vastly influential, as has the accompanying claim that you cannot directly regulate belief, a staple doctrine of the modern liberal tradition. We find the view that legal authority is fundamentally coordinative in much modern Anglo-American jurisprudence. John Finnis has frequently claimed that legal authority is to be explained by the need to solve coordination problems. And this view of legal direction as coordinatory is, I think, a presupposition too of Joseph Raz's theory that legal obligation is a form of exclusionary reason. I won't go into that, but so, I mean, it's a really influential model. And it's absolutely inconsistent with the view of the church as a potestas, I think. If the church really is a potestas, as Leo XIII taught, that may be because legal authority, even at the level of the state, is not a purely coordinatory device, exclusively directive of the voluntary. Perhaps legal authority can direct even such non-voluntary attitudes as belief, because it serves a purpose more fundamental than mere coordination. And this purpose may help explain what might otherwise be puzzling about the church's authority and jurisdiction. Okay. When the church legally directs us to form a belief, she does so in the course of teaching that the belief legally required of us is true. That's what's going on in magisterial teaching. So that may be what is central to legal authority, teaching and witnessing to truth. Truth about what? Legal authority has jurisdiction over a community, and it serves that community. So it teaches its people about what matters to the flourishing of their community. It witnesses to the truth about what that flourishing involves, and to the obligation on each member of the community to be committed to that flourishing. And obedience to its direction occurs through a trusting reception of that witness. The legal authority is believed. Legal direction then is communicative. The law directing us not to steal, taking the law of theft as an example, helps communicate that stealing is very seriously wrong. The judge who sentences a thief to prison does so to send a message that property rights are morally important, and that disregard for them is damaging to the community and so deserving of punishment. And most citizens hear the message and believe it. They refrain from stealing, not out of mere fear of punishment, but because they do believe that property rights are indeed morally important, and stealing really is morally seriously wrong. We now begin to see how the legal direction of belief itself is possible. In directing us, imposing a legal obligation on us to believe something, and standing ready to punish disbelief when expressed in the external forum, legal authority is not issuing an arbitrary command that exploits enforcing sanctions merely as objects of dislike. That would never work. Instead, the authority is witnessing to a truth, and in accompanying the teaching of that truth with the imposition of an obligation to believe it and threats of sanction for violation of that obligation, the authority is witnessing not only to that truth itself, but to the importance to the community that the truth be generally believed, and to the immense damage done to the community by disbelief. The use of law to form the beliefs of those subject to authority is not an aberrant or impossible use of law at all. Legal direction is supposed to work by forming the beliefs of those subject to it. And even in modern secular states, legal direction may sometimes effectively involve direction of belief itself. Many continental European states now impose Holocaust denial laws that forbid and punish public expression of disbelief in the Holocaust. These aren't attempts to impose laws on voluntary action, somehow indirectly to produce belief the Holocaust did happen. Stopping someone from denying the Holocaust certainly won't of itself make them believe it happened. It's a way by which the state witnesses both to the truth that the Holocaust did happen and to the seriousness of the damage to the community from disbelief in it, sufficient to warrant punishing that disbelief's expression in the external forum. We're dealing with modern heresy laws, effectively. So legal direction is not simply about coordinating voluntary actions. Its function is more fundamental. It serves to teach about the common good that its authority serves. It enables us to respond to truth and goodness at the level of our non-voluntary attitudes, our beliefs and motivations, where those attitudes are of central importance to the community whose flourishing the legal authority protects. The legal authority of the state does this for truth and goodness as these matter at the natural level, the level of natural reason. The legal authority of the church does this for truth and goodness at the supernatural level, the level of grace, or as some scholastics used to call it, like Suarez, the level of higher reason. In both cases, the exercise of legal authority serves to form belief and may even impose legal obligations and belief itself. But to be effective in this way, legal authority must be epistemically authoritative. Since legal authority directs its people by witnessing to them, to succeed in forming and directing their beliefs, legal authority must be received and trusted by its people as indeed a credible witness to what it teaches. This is true of the legal authority of the state. One form of breakdown in state legitimacy is when people stop trusting the state as a witness to the common good. Why are the lying bastards lying to us? They get my cudgels out. But it's true of the legal authority of the church too. Unless the church is already taken to be epistemically authoritative, both for the various truths she claims and for the importance of belief in them, her direction of people to believe them as a matter of obligation cannot be directive law. She is not yet a credible witness. Our disposition to treat the state as an authoritative witness to the bonum commune is natural. It is part of human nature so to respect political authority, at least presumptively. And this requires no special moment of conversion. But in the case of the church, acknowledgement of her as an authoritative witness must be granted to us gratuitously through grace. It already involves assent to revelation. The credibility of the church as a witness depends on revelation both about Christ and about the church's unique relation to him, as founded by him to continue and interpret his saving mission. Revelation which explains why the church is indeed the authoritative witness that she claims to be. Accepting the church's authority as witness involves assenting to this revelation. Otherwise, she's just not a credible witness. Such assent already amounts to entry into the faith. But as a presupposition of our responding to the church's teaching as directive law, this assent cannot itself occur as such a response. It cannot be an acceptance of the faith that is legally coerced. Recognition of the church's authority as witness may precede our moral or legal responsibility, as in those baptized from infancy who just grow up with a presumptive trust in ecclesial authority. But in an adult who is already responsible but does not yet believe, trust in ecclesial authority as witness must come from an uncoerced conversion, an initial acceptance of the faith that is both free metaphysically but not imposed on them by law. And this faith in adults is a condition of their baptism and entry into the church's jurisdiction, because the church's jurisdiction is at the service of faith, and receipt by the disbelieving of her sacraments is an abuse of them. So we can, I think, explain why the church can never coercively direct people into the faith, and why there is always a consent condition, a need for free acceptance of the faith as a condition of entry into the church that has no parallel at the political level. But to see this, we need to abandon the very pointedly anti-integralist account of legal authority and its function left to us by Hobbes. We need instead to understand both church and state as coercive teachers, which the state plainly is, and the church also is under Catholic doctrine. Any peculiarity about the case of the church does not show at all that she is not a potestas. It comes from the fact that she is a potestas for faith. She is a coercive teacher whose authority and witness is supernatural rather than natural. No.
Okay, next we'll have Alan Fimister.
First of all, I'd like to thank Tyler and Brian for inviting me to contribute to this panel, and Kevin Vallier for having given me an advanced electronic copy of his book from which to prepare these remarks. I must confess, however, that my other commitments were such that I was not able to read the text properly until a few weeks ago, and so I was unable to warn him in advance that the Empress Irene was the regent of Constantine VI and not Constantine IV, or that Philip IV's men attacked Boniface VIII in Anini and not in Rome, and other little pedantic, narrow-minded observations of this kind. Most of all, however, I would like to thank Kevin for writing this book. It is important that the integralist conversation is not exclusively internal, with the only external voices being shouts of abuse. It is important that we do not speak at cross purposes. There is enough speaking at cross purposes even within that conversation, and this arises from the very broad range of motivations and interests that led the participants into that conversation in the first place. That said, there is a good deal of speaking cross purposes going on between Kevin and the theorists he identifies in all the kingdoms of the world. And I think, in a way, the most fruitful way into the book from an integralist perspective might be to identify and unravel a few of those. So in the short time available here, therefore, I would like to deal with three areas of importance where the wrong end of the stick has, in my estimation, been grasped with some force. The first is the theological note of integralism, the second, the basis of civil legitimacy in Catholic doctrine, and the third is transition. So first of all, integralism is not a school or flavor of Catholicism. It is simply a term for orthodoxy in regard to a particular area of Catholic doctrine, the obligations of whole societies towards the true religion and the one Church of Christ, to use Dignitatis Humanae's expression. In expounding the obligations of whole societies to the true religion and the one Church of Christ, integralists most often have recourse to the teachings of Leo XIII, and most particularly to the encyclicals Libertas and Immortale Dei. This is not unreasonable, as both these documents are cited by Dignitatis Humanae itself. They are also singled out for praise by St. John Paul II in his 1991 encyclical Sanctissimus Annus, along with Arcanum Divinae Sapientiae, Dieternum Illud Immortale Dei, Sapientiae Christianae, Quod Apostolici Muneris, and of course, Rerum Novarum. That is 7 of the 9 principal acts of Leo's pontificate, which he enumerated the year before his death in 1902, and which Etienne Gilson gathered in one volume in The Church Speaks to the Modern World, recently reprinted by the Luca Press. The single greatest exposition of integralism anywhere, which I was disappointed to see makes no appearance at all in all the kingdoms of the world. Gilson is particularly interesting as an integralist Republican, with no interest in Action Française or Vichy, who served as a senator for the Mouvement Républicain Populaire in France, and is singled out for praise by John Paul II in Fides et Ratio. Libertas, the second of Leo XIII's 9 principal acts, is significant in many ways, not least its condemnation of liberalism as literally satanic. Leo writes, "If when men discussed the question of liberty, they were careful to grasp its true and legitimate meaning, such as reason and reasoning have just explained, they would never venture to affix such calumny on the Church as to assert that she is the foe of individual and public liberty. But many there are who follow in the footsteps of Lucifer and adopt as their own his rebellious cry, 'I will not serve,' and consequently substitute for true liberty what is sheer and most foolish license. Such, for instance, are the men belonging to that widely spread and powerful organization who, usurping the name of liberty, style themselves liberals." John Paul II both approvingly notes Leo's condemnation of liberalism as a social and economic system, and says of the encyclical itself, here particular mention must be made of the encyclical Libertas Prestigissimum, which called attention to the essential bond between human freedom and truth, so that human freedom which refused to be bound to the truth would fall into arbitrariness and end up submitting itself to the vilest of passions to the point of self-destruction. Of course, as a Pole, St. John Paul II hailed from a country which, during its heyday as the largest state in Europe, was a proselytizing integralist polity with an elective republican monarchy and religious liberty. Consequently, he is less prone to confuse the question of the legitimacy in principle of giving civil effect to canon law with the prudential question of which penal sanctions might prudently be attached to its violation. This distinction is nicely illustrated by Article 1 of the Polish Constitution of 1791, which reads, "The dominant national religion is and shall be the sacred Roman Catholic faith with all its laws. Passage from the dominant religion to any other confession is forbidden under penalties of apostasy. Inasmuch as that same holy faith bids us to love our neighbours, we owe to all persons of whatever persuasion peace in their faith and the protection of the government, and therefore we guarantee freedom to all rights and religions in the Polish lands in accordance with the laws of the land." John Paul II is therefore something of a mine of integralist quotations. One recalls his remarks in Baltimore in 1995, "Every generation of Americans needs to know that freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought." or his protest in the year 2000 against the failure of the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights to mention Christianity or invoke God, which memorably ends with the words, "The rights of God and man stand and fall together." Most important, however, is section 2244 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is partly encompasses a quotation from Sanctissimus Annus, which is surely the most succinct existing summary of integralism. The Catechism reads, "Every institution is inspired, at least implicitly, by a vision of man and his destiny, from which it derives the point of reference for its judgment, its hierarchy of values, its line of conduct. Most societies have formed their institutions in the recognition of a certain preeminence of man over things. Only the divinely revealed religion has clearly recognized man's origin and destiny in God, the Creator and Redeemer. The Church invites political authorities to measure their judgments and decisions against this inspired truth about God and man. Societies not recognizing this vision or rejecting it in the name of their independence from God are brought to seek their criteria and goal in themselves, or to borrow them from some ideology. Since they do not admit that one can defend an objective criterion of good and evil, they arrogate to themselves an explicit or implicit totalitarian power over man and his destiny, as history shows." One notes here that, as in his protest in 2000, St. John Paul II ties the failure by the state to recognize the inspired truth about God and man to the rejection of an objective criterion of good and evil, and ultimately to totalitarianism. Integralism is therefore analogous to terms like Trinitarian, Diophysite, or iconodual, simply a word for orthodoxy in a particular area. There are a number of dogmatic definitions of the Church which require integralism of all those who, in the words of the 1990 Alessio Fidei, with firm faith believe everything contained in the Word of God, whether written or handed down in tradition, which the Church, either by a solemn judgment or by the ordinary and universal magisterium, sets forth to be believed as divinely revealed. I could mention Unam Sanctam and Canon 14 of Trent on baptism, upon which Tom Pink has thrown so much light, but I think two particularly striking examples are the closing paragraph of the Creed of Pope Pius IV and the second of the propositions solemnly condemned by Pope Pius IX in Quanta Cura. I'll take the second of these two first. It's striking because St. John Henry Newman, who was not an enthusiast for the document, with Quanta Cura as one of the two examples of an obviously infallible document, precisely in order to contrast it with the syllabus of errors. Kevin seems to have read Newman's letter to the Duke of Norfolk, in which he makes this point, but seems to have missed this distinction between the letter and the syllabus, and to elide the two, which is something Newman protests about. He gives almost no theological note to the syllabus at all, whereas he thinks Quanta Cura is infallible. The second condemned proposition is also striking because the terms in which Pius IX condemns it, as against the doctrine of Scripture, of the Church, and of the Holy Fathers, make it clear that it is being condemned as directly opposed to divine revelation, and therefore heretical and not merely erroneous. Nor is Newman alone. While the status of the syllabus was much contested, the infallibility of Quanta Cura was, among those who accepted the doctrine of papal infallibility, unanimously recognized. Indeed, Newman is clearly correct that the formula of condemnation leaves no doubt of the irreformable character of the condemnations. So this is the formula used in the document by Pius IX. Therefore, by our apostolic authority, we reprobate, prescribe, and condemn all the singular and evil opinions and doctrines severally mentioned in this letter, and will and command that they be thoroughly held by all children of the Catholic Church as reprobated, prescribed, and condemned. What then is the second proposition condemned by Quanta Cura? That is the best condition of civil society in which no duty is recognized as attached to the civil power of restraining by enacted penalties offenders against the Catholic religion, except so far as public peace may require. The strict contrary, therefore, that is the best condition of civil society in which a duty is recognized as attached to the civil power of restraining by enacted penalties offenders against the Catholic religion, and not only when public peace may so require. Therefore, a dogma, and a baptized person who obstinately denies this dogma is a heretic, in late sententio excommunicate. Neither Maritain nor his disciple Paul VI denied this dogma. Paul VI personally insisted on the insertion into Dignitatis Humanae of the saving clause about the traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of whole societies to the true religion and the one Church of Christ. And Maritain made it clear in the primacy of the spiritual that he accepted the full panoply of powers claimed by Innocent III and Boniface VIII. And in Integral Humanism itself twice describes his doctrine in express terms as integralist. They simply thought that it was imprudent to exercise these powers because in the context of modern pluralist democracies, which they thought highly valuable, they would, they judged, be counterproductive. If they can be accused of anything, it is of forgetfulness of the doctrine of the two cities, rather than of integralism per se. The best condition of civil society might include civil penalties for offenders against the Catholic religion, but it would also include other things, and Paul VI and Maritain thought enough of those things would be lost by the imposition of such penalties in the world in which they lived, that the trade-off would be unprofitable. Maritain, as Kevin concedes, though rather bewilderedly, expressly accepts that in some other social conditions, the restoration of the more robust medieval arrangements would be perfectly legitimate. Maritain writes, the fecundity of analogy in this domain is, moreover, clearly not exhausted by the historical ideal whose main outlines I've tried to sketch. Others still could arise under historical climates of which we have no idea, and there is even nothing to prevent minds attached to a Christian sacral conception from admitting the hypothesis of an eventual cycle of culture in which it would prevail anew under conditions and with characteristics which we cannot foresee. Now for the Creed of Pius IV. This document is one of the four principal creeds of the Church and was used for hundreds of years into the 20th century as the standard means of reconciling heretics and schismatics to the Church. Should Kevin ever be overcome by the pull of the Unam Sanctam and find himself in the vicinity of a church staffed by the Fraternity of St. Peter, I believe they would be happy to reconcile him with this very formula. Alas, in our more ecumenical times, less august and dare one say robust formulae are more routinely employed. But as the CDF pointed out in 1998, the diversity of these symbols expresses the richness of the one faith. None of them is superseded or nullified by subsequent professions of faith formulated in response to later historical circumstances. The closing paragraph of the Creed of Pius IV makes clear that Christians holding any kind of office are obligated to do what they can to ensure the profession of that faith without which it is impossible to be saved by those in their care. This creed, unlike the 1998 Professor of Fide, is not intended only for those teaching or holding office in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, but for all Christians. It reads, "This true Catholic faith, outside of which no one can be saved, which I now freely profess and to which I truly adhere, I do so profess and swear to maintain inviolate and with firm constancy with the help of God until the last breath of life, and I shall strive as far as possible that this same faith shall be held, taught and professed by all those over whom I have charge. I, Alan Fimister, do so pledge, promise and swear, so help me God and these holy Gospels of God." All of which brings me to point number 2, the Catholic doctrine of civil legitimacy. Kevin puts a great deal of effort into squeezing the Church's teaching into the Procrustean bed of various modern theories of civil obedience, which no Catholic could legitimately hold anyway. He would have done better to read Leo XIII's De Eternum on the origin of the civil power, helpfully contained in Gilson's book. The existence of God can be known with certainty by the natural right of human reason, as is dogmatically defined by the Church at Vatican I. As St. Paul, to whose teaching Vatican I and the Oath Against Modernism both appeal, makes clear that the principal precepts of the natural law are also available to natural reason, hence the name, natural law. And first among them is the obligation to worship God in the manner he has appointed, and thus those who fail to do so are without excuse, in St. Paul's expression. Sticking with St. Paul, and indeed the letter to the Romans, the Catholic Church holds that the powers that are ordained of God, as Leo XIII puts it in Immortale Dei, De Eternum. In every association and community of men, necessity itself compels that some should hold preeminence, lest society, deprived of a prince or head by which it is ruled, should come to dissolution and be prevented from attaining the end for which it was created and instituted. Very many men of more recent times, walking in the footsteps of those who in a former age assumed to themselves the name of philosophers, say that all power comes from the people, so that those who exercise it in the state do so not as their own, but as delegated to them by the people, and that by this rule it can be revoked by the will of the very people to whom it was delegated. But from these Catholics dissent, who affirm that the right to rule is from God, as from a natural and necessary principle. The state exists because and derives its authority from the fact that man is a social and political animal. God made man a social and political animal, and so the civil power derives its authority to rule from him. As St. John Chrysostom pointed out long ago, this has no relevance to the various forms of government, nor does it mean that God chooses the rulers under whom we live, whatever the Speaker of the House of Representatives may hold. God also instituted marriage through human nature, and our obligations to our spouses are backed by his authority. But as for whom we choose to marry, that's on us. Being therefore natural institutions, the state and the family are juridical persons in natural law, and owe God all the same obligations as the individual, first among which is to worship God in the manner he has appointed. Here the 13th again. The state, constituted as it is clearly bound to act upon the manifold and weighty duties linking it to God by the public profession of religion. Nature and reason, which command every individual devoutly to worship God in holiness, because we belong to him and must return to him, since we came from him, bind also the civil community by a like law. For men living together in society are under the power of God, no less than individuals are, and society, no less than individuals, owes gratitude to God who gave it being and maintains it, and whose ever bounteous goodness enriches it with countless blessings. Since then no one is allowed to be remiss in the service due to God, and since the chief duty of all men is to cling to religion, in both its preaching and practice, not such religion as they may have a preference for, but the religion which God enjoins, and which certain and most clear marks show to be the only one true religion, it is a public crime to act as though there were no God. So too it is a sin for the state not to have care for religion as something beyond its scope, or as of no practical benefit, or out of many forms of religion, to adopt that one which chimes in with the fancy, for we are bound absolutely to worship God in that way which he has shown to be his will. Based on natural reason alone, therefore, we would expect that the civil power would identify God as the source of all blessings, public and private, identify our most pressing need to seek those blessings at his hands, and discover and embrace the true religion. The content of that religion cannot itself be deduced by natural reason, because as Lateran 4 famously defined, God is more unlike than he is like anything we assert about him, and so we need to discover this religion through revelation. Fortunately, God had made the true religion obvious. One might therefore expect that the civil power would simply embrace this revelation and require its subjects to do likewise by means of all its resources, coercive and persuasive, just as it obliges loyalty and service in time of war, or enacts sweeping measures to save us all from climate change. The failure to propitiate the creator of the entire universe is obviously far more fatal to the good of human society than rising sea levels or foreign tyrants. There are two reasons the civil power cannot do this. One which applies to the non-Christian state, and another which applies to the Catholic polity. The non-Christian state cannot enforce conformity to its religion of choice because it is a false religion, and being false, God does not facilitate adherence to it with the gift of supernatural faith. Therefore, its adherents know that it is merely a matter of opinion, and that it would therefore be immoral to enforce adherence to it. The Catholic polity cannot compel adherence because the actual end appointed for man through this religion infinitely exceeds the natural good, and therefore to induce its acceptance by finite threats and punishments would be to induce blasphemy. Those who do adhere to the Catholic faith, however, as St. Thomas observes, more firmly adhere to the things that are of faith than to the first principles of reason. This is why obstinate formal heresy is the worst of all sins, and in a Christian sacral order the most terrible of all crimes. As St. Ignatius of Antioch says, no man who is responsible for defiling a household can expect any share in the kingdom of God. Even in the world, defilement of this kind is punishable with death. How much more when a man's subversive doctrines defile the God-given faith for which Jesus Christ was crucified? Such a wretch in his uncleanness is bound for the unquenchable fire, and so is anyone else who gives him a hearing. The baptized ruler, striving as his faith demands as hard as possible that same faith shall be held, taught, and professed by all those over whom he has charge, also discovers that he has no authority to determine the content of measures directed to the specifically revealed end without the consent of the spiritual power. There is no difficulty explaining the coercive power of the church. Man is a social and political animal who naturally lives in a law-based society of coercive powers. The unexpected thing is that instead of leaving these powers in the hands of the temporal power, God reveals that they are to be bifurcated, with matters relating to religion placed under a distinct governing power. He does this because of the problem of simony already mentioned. But this difficulty is not manifest to unenlightened reason, which does not know of the supernatural end of the obligation of worship, which is, of course, why secular polities attempt to enforce conformity to their ideological values, because they don't think that these questions are beyond their competence. Finally, I would like to turn to transition. This is quite straightforward. One simply converts enough people to establish the civil effect of canon law upon the baptized within the constitutional order one happens to inhabit. In 6th century England, that meant one king. In 21st century America, it means however many millions necessary to amend the US Constitution. This is Leo XIII's policy of ralliement, which was well on the way to success in the US until Marytown's eccentric prudential judgments were adopted by the Roman pontiff. If only it had been pursued for 100 years instead of only 80, we might all now be enjoying its benefits. It is often forgotten, including by Kevin, that the Third Republic, to which Leo XIII told Catholics to rally, was, despite being packed to the gills with Freemasons, confessedly Catholic until 1905. Alexis de Tocqueville pointed out that the USA, the well-ordered republic, as Leo called it, is particularly well suited to spiritual conquest by the Catholic Church. What would the integralist version of the well-ordered republic look like? It is hard to say because the extent of civil penalties is a prudential question to be agreed between the two powers. Assuming it remained a democracy and a republic, it could, I suppose, adopt a scary Iranian complexion with the devil's stinking martyrs well and worthily burned, in St. Thomas More's charming expression, but it might equally well assume a less alarming, more Polish aspect, with apostates merely forfeiting their citizenship, as Newman suggests in the Apologia Privy to Sua. One thing is certain, though, the non-baptized could never be legitimately threatened into joining the church by the loss of temporal goods, including citizenship and the right to transmit it to their heirs, even if non-Catholic foreigners could no longer acquire it. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that burning heretics is probably not a good idea. It's not that it's contrary to the will of the Spirit or anything silly like that, but for those who lack the theological virtue of faith, it will inevitably give the impression that the faithful remain true to the holy faith out of terror rather than conviction. Of course, if the only other people around are adherents of the law of Moses or the deliverances of Muhammad, this would hardly matter, given their prescriptions in this area. But times change and people remember, and stern measures adopted in the 13th century can become a significant cause of scandal in later, less enlightened eras, as we all know. And who knows how many reformations and enlightenments the church may need to endure before the Lord calls time on human folly. So all I know is, as Newman remarked in the chapter of the letter to the Duke of Norfolk that Kevin skipped, that Catholicity is the only divine form of religion, and thus in societies, in centuries to come, there may be found out some way of uniting what is free in the new structure of society with what is authoritative in the old, without any base compromise with progress or liberalism.
Okay, so finally, Tyler McNabb and Brian Besong.
That's you.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I'm Tyler. That's Brian.
Yeah, hi.
First, Kevin, I just want to say thanks very much for writing the book. Really enjoyed it. It's one of my favorite books of the year that I've read. Right. So an institution is integralist to the degree that it deliberately exercises its natural authority for supernatural good of those who oversees it. Integralist policy, we're going to take it's more diverse, varied by practical circumstances and prudential considerations. Such circumstances include a variety of ways in which the social order and institutions that comprise it contributes to the overall supernatural end of those who constitute it. And integralist institutions are commonplace, we actually think. So how loose we're going to define integralism? We think families, schools, hospitals, businesses, social clubs, among other things, can be considered integralist. Chick-fil-A may not, glorious evangelical chicken, may not be able to do as much supernatural good as, say, a Catholic university, but both should do what they can for the supernatural betterment of those who they oversee. Of all natural institutions, the state That's going to do like the most in reference to the supernatural good. And our remarks will focus on defending integralist states. So in Kevin's recent book, All Kingdoms of the World, he utilizes the following theses to kind of comprise the kind of necessary conditions of integralism, so to speak, or at least that comprise integralism. And in fact, I use them as well in my own work. Natural authority, God directs the state to advance the natural common good, G of community C. Supernatural authority, God directs the church to advance the supernatural common good, S of all baptized persons, NC. And indirect supernatural sovereignty to advance S. And only for this reason, the church may mandate state policies, P, backed by civil penalties, E, that advance S directly without extensively undermining G or S in some respect. So here are some important hesitations. Again, I like the account, I use it in my own work, but here are some we think it's perhaps more broad. God also calls the church to make disciples of all nations, and not only to make saints of those already baptized. Supernatural authority is thus more expansive, we think. For a similar reason, the church needn't direct its guidance of states to only those policies that positively affect the baptized. And we think maybe this is in tension a little bit with the third thesis. Integralists would also say support the use of state monopolies, state monies to promote evangelism or develop a new cathedral. So basically, we're kind of making a demarcation here between kind of like soft authority and strong authority. And so we think that soft authority, and so far as the state is concerned, can bring out coercion for those who are non-baptized. It's just the stronger authority which baptism becomes relevant. But we're going to go ahead and take these theses as sound. In our views, Vallier does an admirable job motivating the state, being integralist, in chapters 2 and 3. You do a really good job making the case for integralism, Kevin. I really appreciated the case. He then moves to tear down the integralist fortress he constructs. We focus on responding to the negative phase of the book. No need to further endorse Kevin's original arguments. As we see it, there are three important arguments. First, there is what we call the transitional argument. The transitional argument, however, is specifically aimed at discrediting Adrian Vermeule's proposal for the integralist construction. So it has kind of limited relevance to those who see alternative paths to integralism. The idea is that Vermeule argues for a top-down takeover of the liberal state rather than winning over every citizen or most citizens. According to Vallier, Vermeule offers an integralist three-pronged plan. First, as liberalism continues to implode around us, we need to build community. We have to teach the faithful, especially the faithful who wield power, about integralism and the truth of common good constitutionalism. Second, we move to get integralists in power. So this would include, judges, politicians, maybe even those in media, etc. Finally, the integralists in their positions of powers act like integralists and take over the imploding liberal state. But is the plan sound? Vallier thinks not. The proper function of liberal democracies is to create trust between diverse individuals, he thinks, and Vallier predicts that trust would decrease in this transition, especially among groups who the Catholic Church has been historically in tension with. Moreover, the church has its problems in solving its own scandals. Are we to think that there wouldn't be corrupt leadership on display as the state becomes confessional? Recall that Vermeule's envisioned societies like ours being taken over, in which there is only a minority of faithful Catholics taking power. So Vallier predicts failure. We're going to do a little bit of popcorn here.
The second argument we call the stability argument. Vallier takes it for granted that proper polity is stable. Yet Vallier, on page 182, argues that the integralist state will be anything but stable, as he argues rational actors will avoid baptizing their children, or at least doing so publicly, to prevent their being under the authority of the church and state policy and promotion of the church. Integralist states will implode, and even relatively quickly. Vallier implies integralist states could hardly last 1 century on page 197. Both the transition and stability arguments are wedded to a paradigm of modeling human decision-making that will seem foreign to many philosophers and theologians, but which is common in economics and political science, that is, rational choice theory. RCT has its origins in utility maximizing analyses of human decision-making, with a standard model used in economics treating agents as perfectly rational, self-interested actors deliberating with perfect information. Variations on RCT, and there are many, allow for bounded rationality, limited information, and reasons for action independent of utilitarian style self-interest. Social scientists are far from uniform in what the right approach to RCT should look like. And although it remains dominant, RCT was subject to intense academic debate in the mid-90s after it was pointed out how little the speculative formal models engage with rigorous empirical research, either in incorporating their findings into the prediction of the models or in subjecting the models to rigorous empirical testing. One of the outcomes of Green and Shapiro's Pathologies of Rational Choice Theory in 1994 was that increasingly social scientists working within this paradigm have explicitly linked RCT to so-called Mertonian middle-range theory, the latter of which is directly oriented to empirically testable and tested predictions. They increasingly moved away from unempirical abstract speculation, which seems particularly fitting given how variant the formulations of RCT are, and how many different so-called micro-foundations, that is, about motives and rationality, are put forward by theorists. We take no position here on the empirical soundness of RCT models before that shift. Suffice to say that what Vallier provides the reader appears to lack the immediate testable predictions that would have helped validate his long-term predictions for an integralist state. Moreover, Vallier modifies RCT in ways, such as the introduction of motives not ordinarily countenanced, that precise testing would be important. For the general empirical reliability of RCT would only ambiguously support his uniquely modified model. Vallier's predictions are also highly counterintuitive, for his models postulate that integralism dramatically increases pluralism. Using a similar methodology arising from RCT, Vallier has made a series of arguments for liberalism, suggesting it increases solidarity and mutual trust. Though to be clear, he makes no argument for liberalism in this book. We do not need to look far to see that our liberal democracy appears as one of the most highly fissured and distrusting societies in history. Moreover, nearly every society before modernity was integralist to some degree. Many remain so. Any reasonable history of, say, the Holy Roman Empire would not suggest that ideologically pluralistic fragmentation occurred throughout that society, full stop, especially not that it occurred more rapidly than occurred in nearly every liberal 20th century nation. And in a far cry from eking out a century before dissolution, as Vallier suggests, the Holy Roman Empire existed for roughly 1,000 years. Even the papal states had a longer lifespan than any contemporary liberal state, which arose arguably no earlier than the 18th century.
But again, what we find is not what Vallier proposes. Oh, sorry. Vallier envisions all kingdoms of the world as a standpoint critique of integralism, even though there is an epilogue that focuses on kind of maybe salvaging or helping liberalism out. While liberalism being the dominant rival to integralism, defending the latter against Vallier's critiques most naturally involves thinking through the available alternatives, including the one he spent considerable time defending. In other words, Vallier seems to see the liberal state as a genuinely pluralistic state. It is a state that does not force a religious viewpoint on anyone. It's a form of government that can reasonably accommodate people of all faiths and beliefs. So social trust should be high and stability is secured, as he predicts. But again, what we find is not what Vallier proposes. In a liberal state after a liberal state, one finds forms of civil religion. This will be no surprise to the mainstream religious studies and academics and social scientists who, following Emile Durkheim, have long postulated that religion is inescapable, a perversive part of all social structures, indeed a necessary unifying force of social cohesion. Put differently, integralism may be practically unavoidable given human nature. Today, nearly all so-called liberal states are confessional, adhering to, at least on this account of religion, a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things that apart and forbidden beliefs and practices which unite in one single moral community. That was a quote, sorry. The US forces children to learn radical gender theory, regardless of what their parents think. Following the government's examples, workplaces and universities can and do fire you for heresy if you deny the latest intersexual orthodoxy. In fact, in the US's northern neighbor, in Canada, in a kind of Matara fashion, will take your child away from you if you don't affirm your child's gender identity. Of course, Western governments continue to fund the killing of prenatal humans. Such killing is widely seen as a sacred right of women, a liberal sacrament, you could say. We say nothing about the extremes to which the UK has now been reduced. Of course, Vallier, sorry about that, guys. Vallier will think that this doesn't have to be the case, that we and our neighbors are doing liberal democracy maybe all wrong. True liberal democracy hasn't been tried, or if it has been tried, it wasn't tried for very long. Much of the same we might add for the so-called, quote, true communism. We think that this shows that integralism is inevitable, no matter where one initially starts from. States cannot help but be integralist, at least eventually. And so here, the bringing up of liberalism is relevant, even though Kevin doesn't argue for liberalism in the book, because we think that there's sort of an inevitability argument where all other alternatives to integralism end up turning into integralist systems. If a formal model suggests that these many appearances are deceiving, liberal states really do increase trust and unity among a plurality, and the integralist states really do increase distrust and fragmentation, then one would expect the model to be accompanied by rigorous empirical confirmation, or at least middle-range testable predictions that could, if confirmed, help outweigh the strong contrary initial appearances. After all, Vallier is not the first philosopher to make sociological predictions on formalized philosophical grounds. One philosopher to make sociological predictions on formalized naturally thinks of similar formalistic predictions against capitalism, say in Das Kapital. Which have thus far remained merely armchair speculation. Moreover, many of the elements of this model overlap with existing integralist states. You might even include, like on soft integralism, Poland, Costa Rica, Malta, Iran. Some empirical testing seems not only necessary, but immediately possible. But the appearance from all these states is not one envisioned by Vallier. How much stock is then should we put into this rational choice modelization?
Finally, in chapter 6, Vallier gives what he calls the justice argument. Why can the state coerce some and not others? Following Pink, Vallier says baptism. Vallier takes integralists to be committed to baptism as what he calls a moral transformer, indeed the only transformer he countenances. Baptism brings you under the jurisdiction of the church and consequently integralist state policy. According to Vallier, Aquinas thought baptism acts as a moral transformer because baptism involves a vow. If you give vows to the church and freely enter the church's ecclesiastical structure, then you are obligated to obey it. But as Vallier points out, infants make no explicit baptismal vows. Is it just to force a subject baptized as an infant to follow the church, especially under threat of physical force? Vallier says no. Vallier points to the justice argument as forming a dilemma I think very clearly stated in a paper on the justice argument also recently published. Quote, "It seems strange that states cannot force people into the faith, but can make them remain in it, and odder still to think that baptism makes the difference." End quote. This suggests two problems. One, in how to make sense of so-called moral transformers, which I understand to be circumstances or facts that generate unique and inescapable obligations for an individual that we are not initially obliged to pursue. The second is in thinking that baptism is a moral transformer. To the first problem, Vallier seems to think that obligations arising from moral transformation cannot be stronger than obligations to be morally transformed, but that's a mistake. Moral transformers of this sort are all around us. Joanna cannot force Tim to marry her, but if Tim decides to do so, he now inescapably has obligations to her. I had no obligation to marry and have children, but now done, I cannot escape my parental obligations. Can baptism be a moral transformer? Vallier's concern is quintessentially, and I think perhaps question-beggingly, liberal. Baptized infants are not free to reject baptism and the duties it entails, since they lack personal abilities sufficient to opt out. Now, why is that a problem? After all, we cannot opt out of every moral transformer, even when we neither explicitly nor implicitly opt in. After marrying Tim, Joanna contracts Zika. Although Joanna would like to have children immediately, she must postpone given the risk of birth defects. Getting Zika is a moral transformer. Now, is it wrong to morally transform another without consent? That depends. Some moral transformers bring only hardships, such as Joanna experienced, but many others enable a flourishing that is otherwise unattainable despite being associated with inescapable and unique obligations. Given circumstances beyond his control, Donald knows his own local community's good, a community he was not obliged to be a member of, mind you, will be destroyed without his relatively easy intervention. This is a moral transformer, for the circumstances obligate Donald to help. But the good Donald attains, both for the community and for himself given his public assistance, helps him flourish. And the community's ask was not wrong, therefore, even though it acted as a transformer without Donald's consent. Adam and Eve were morally transformed by a command not to eat of the tree, and again, without consent. God did no wrong in introducing a new responsibility like this.
So in closing, it's also worth adding that Vallier's target is a particular kind of integralism, we think. But there are other alternatives with respect to integralism. See McNabb, God and Political Theory. He's defended a soft integralism that says nothing about punishing of heretics or the foster care of baptized children who might be raised by non-Christians. Rather, it focuses on the church's ability to coerce and relate it to matters regarding, say, taxation to fund missionary activity, teaching the Catholic faith in state-funded schools, and publicly declaring Christ is king on behalf of all of its citizens. And here, obviously, this is all done for the supernatural end. Perhaps by the movement or the start of the church. In fact, toward the end of the volume, Vallier seems to suggest that integralists should endorse more modest confessional states, maybe such as the one that I just mentioned here. So even if Vallier's arguments can all be salvaged and we're just like totally and radically wrong, as I'm sure Kevin's like, yes, that's right. Nonetheless, there are alternatives, kind of weaker integralist models that may be, and it seems like textually from his work, he might be more open to. Whatever one's preferred model, whether hard, soft, sunny side up, right? Vallier's recent book helps the integralist of all stripes refine the contours of the debate and put forward even stronger defenses than might be possible if all held to Catholic doctrine on the role of the state in supporting our supernatural good. So we recommend it. It's a good read, Kevin. All right.
And Kevin, all of us are ahead of time, so if you want to, you don't have to feel as rushed. So if you want to take maybe 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, I'd say is fine.
Okay, all right. Well, that'll give everyone time to get the handout.
And while that's happening, I want to make clear, we are recording the session. It's not being live streamed, but when we go into the Q&A, if you feel reluctant to have your voice as part of the recording, no one's on camera right now except the front panel, but it will be recorded. So.
Back. Okay, well, so let me begin by thanking the panel. Thank you, all of you, for coming. One of the most shocking things about writing on this topic is the interest is extraordinary, particularly among very young people. And I knew this, but seeing the degree of it as I go to different places and speak on it has been pretty remarkable. Okay, so I have about 15, 20 minutes. So I've got to move through an hour of comments. So forgive me if I leave some things out here and there. Just so we know, just to stress this from the outset, the goal of the book is to assess Catholic integralism and provide a kind of internal critique of it, right? We look at arguments for it, arguments against it, and then we try to make up our minds. And then I apply to other religious anti-liberal views in Sunni Islam and Chinese Confucianism. Here's what's not the project: defending liberalism at all. I've done this. I figured this book could be about something else. So for what I say, everything, and I say this on page 5, integralism and liberalism could just both be false. They're nothing like mutually exclusive, not even close. And so I think a lot of the stuff on liberalism or comparisons with liberalism are things that an author meets critics on the book that it's fair for me move past. Now, let's begin with this business about how to define integralism. I'm just very close to Tom's view, but there is this interesting thing that we see from Brian, Tyler, and Alan, which is a broader definition of integralism. And I guess I begin by saying I'm unsure why we would want to do this. Stretching the definition makes the view less interesting and unique. I think there's the thought that, well, if we can expand integralism enough, then it will be mutually exclusive with liberalism, and then we can get to integralism by refuting liberalism. I'm not entirely sure, but it seems to me that, it's just kind of a strange thing to want to expand it so rapidly or so broadly beyond, say, what Leo XIII says in Immortality Dei. But what I would say, even to those who would stretch the use of the term, my definition, I think, here is at least the peer view. And if the peer view is false, I think that's a problem for integralism. Okay, so then moving on to the transition argument. And here, the basic idea is that reaching integralism is either infeasible or immoral. You really can get to it. It just requires doing a whole lot of things that I think Catholic moral teaching prohibits. So here I use Adrian Vermeule's integration from within as the most feasible strategy, and Brian and Tyler say there are, perhaps surely other routes. But one of the things I say in the book is that I'm not just singling Vermeule out for no reason, or just singling him out because it's even the only view out there. I'm singling it out because he's one of the premier theorists of the modern state and has a variety of arguments throughout his work that say for military or technological and economic reasons, societies are going to tend to become large, modern, complex orders. And so if we want to get to integralism, we're going to have to focus on a big state strategy. So just to be clear, I think that the focus on Vermeule is sort of well motivated, given the nature of modern institutions. Now, Alan says that transition, it's pretty straightforward in a sense. We convert people until we have enough to act. But as Vermeule understands, conversion is importantly nonlinear, right? The patterns of conversion, the relationship between elites and the folk, the relationship between large economic powers, the state and citizens, these are all pretty complicated dynamics, and they're ones that have to be mastered with a certain level of power. And so at least it seems to me that to say, well, we just convert people until we have enough to act, is not really to take the transition issue very seriously. Now, Tom says the thing that I actually think is the best response, which is that, yes, we can't transition now, but we can still know that something like integralism is some kind of ideal because it's magisterially taught. The worry I have here is that it puts all arguments for integralism in one dogmatic basket, which I think makes things pretty highly contentious. It's a pretty thin reed, I think, to hang integralism on. So, even if we accepted Tom's interpretation of integralitas humanae, which I think is very interesting, and if I were pressed, would say was best, but I'm Eastern Orthodox, so I'm not sort of committed here very strongly. And even there, we're not told what the ideal regime is. So I would think the idea that integralism is magisterially taught is probably even more controversial than the interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae. Okay, now to the stability argument. So the stability argument is the one that's most complex. And here the idea is to take on all the core integralist descriptive claims about the way that the modern state works, the way that sin works, and the like, in order to show that integralism will decay on its own accord. So the thought isn't, there's some external shock or problem that leads to integralism to decay, but that it unravels on its own, given all the commitments that integralists have. And so what I did in this case was to build a model, a formal model to test this, and a variety of interesting dynamics arose that I think when we pair them together will create a pretty rapidly destabilizing problem. One is, yes, this line that integralism relative to milder Catholic confessional states, not liberal ones, makes baptism expensive. And I think it's worth noting that every sort of very strong Catholic confessional state, all of them destabilized. They all became milder Catholic confessional states. And I think one of the reasons for this is the sense that having the state backing with the civil code, the Code of Canon Law, just ended up, I think, being really, really coercive in a way that most people didn't find particularly attractive. And I think you can put a fine point on this when you imagine you're in an integralist state, you baptize your child, you send it on up to public authorities where they have a record. And now if your child goes up to be an apostate or a heretic, they're not merely going to be excommunicated, they could be put in jail, depending on what the penalties are. If penalties are light, then we don't get a lot of integralism, I think. But if the penalties are heavy, then I think there's a pretty strong incentive to keep things off the books. That's not the only dynamic in the model. There's a variety of other things. For instance, if integralism is not dogma, I think there'll be disagreement among elites about it. And that's, I think, going to make certain kinds of integralist enforcement problems even more difficult. So again, the prediction here is that at least from the formal model, the strong integralist regimes will tend to become milder Catholic confessional states, which again, I think is pretty much what happened in just about every case that I'm aware of. So Brian and Tyler said that my argument depends on rational choice theory, but they also say that there's a whole bunch of versions of it, which is true. And so I tried to sort of piece through, well, why think it comes under any of those main options? All I do is presume that people respond to incentives at really extreme margins, which I don't think is going to be controversial in any version of rational choice theory. And so I don't think it's sort of arbitrary to appeal to the idea that people respond to incentives at some degree. That's, I think, again, not controversial. The better argument here is that Brian and Tyler ask, well, where's the empirical evidence? Why ignore it? Well, what I say is there's just no empirical evidence for integralist stability, because I think the data is too hard to kind of draw out. I think it's actually hard to know whether there's even been an integralist regime, because I think it's hard to uncover from, say, political science, what the relative powers of Pope and Crown even were. So what you do often when people make a prediction, as the integralists do, when you don't have empirical evidence, is you build a formal model in order to try to see how that's going to work. So think about it like this. So one thing that integralists will often argue is that unless the church has a kind of supernatural sovereignty, or rather political sovereignty over the state in this indirect way, that those regimes will tend to decay. Even if you had a state that was based on natural law and the state isn't, the church isn't supreme in this important way, those regimes will tend to lose their knowledge of natural law, and so will tend to degrade with time, at least all else equal, faster than integralist or non-integralist regime. So this is a kind of qualitative prediction, and it's one that I think is hard to provide empirical evidence for. So again, what do you do in that case? Well, integralists made a prediction, a qualitative prediction, and I thought, okay, well, how would we test this without much empirical evidence? Well, what people often do in the social sciences in this case is someone makes a qualitative prediction, and then you convert it into a quantitative model, and you see under how many different parameters the prediction holds. If it holds under a really broad range of parameters, then you could say, oh, the qualitative claim is probably true. If it holds under a small number of parameters, then you can say the qualitative prediction is probably false. And so that's what I'm kind of doing in the book. I'm saying, look, there's not a lot of empirical evidence here, almost none really. And so we try to reason through this formally. And so I'm not sure Brian and Tyler kind of understood why I was introducing formal modeling in the first place. It was precisely because I didn't think there was empirical evidence that I introduced it. Okay, so now I'll spend the rest of my time on the justice argument. So here, there's been a lot of people who've already articulated it. So for the integralist, religious coercion by the state is unjust before baptism, but permitted after. And the question here is, how can baptism alone morally transform coercion from unjust to just? Here's a very simple way of thinking about it. Dignitatis Humanae says that our right to religious freedom is rooted in our dignity as made in God's image, and that as a result, we're to be immune from coercion by individuals, groups, or any human power. Now, our dignity, if it grounds a right against religious coercion, doesn't go away when we're baptized, right? So what it grounds pre-baptism should be what it grounds afterwards, right? I mean, baptism's an infinite gift from God, but it doesn't remove our dignity, right? And so I don't see in particular why religious coercion would become less problematic. And indeed, I think this is how most people who think about Dignitatis Humanae think about it. Now, in the book, I address 6 different ways of trying to resolve the tension. It's not that I think there's absolutely nothing to say or that this is a knockdown argument or anything like that. And the reason that I included secular theories of political obligation is I thought that was pretty hard to come up with some good options for integralists. And I think one of the most notable things of the panel is that Alan and Tom had different explanations of why, say, coercing the baptized was morally problematic. My sense is this is a nice way that integralists can sort of push the research program forward in trying to articulate precisely what those reasons are. And so I think today the panel, we made actually a little bit of progress. So the reason I used the secular theories is not because I thought, oh yeah, these are definitely what they're going to use. I just thought that you could modify versions of these theories of political obligation to fit the integralist case. And, of course, they don't work very well. But with Brian and Tyler's remarks about moral transformers being common, they gave examples of marriage and then Donald's community membership. But it looks to me that these are examples of consent and associative accounts of our duties. And I know that associative accounts of saying that we have certain duties in virtue of membership, that's been around for thousands of years. I mean, that's not just some sort of thing that analytic political philosophers bandy about. And so it seemed to me that the examples of moral transformers that they gave, by and large, fit into my little bins of options. So I thought we would need another case to get really worried. Alan has a couple of things to say here at different points, pointing out, for instance, that political obligation is natural and comes from God. So what's the problem here? And I think that, these theories, particularly about political authority coming from the people or the divine, we've been worrying about this for 2,300 years at least. And people haven't really settled on any one theory, including divine right theories, including if you are already a theist or a Christian in particular. So for instance, here's one difficulty for divine authority theories. Divine authority leaves open who is authorized to rule and what they're authorized to do. But even more importantly, it leaves open why we have authority over one another. So if the problem of political obligation could be solved through divine command, why is Suarez developing a social contract theory? Or if you look at people in the early social contract tradition, a lot of their worries are, look, God gives commands, but we disagree about how to interpret them. So who has authority over each other to interpret God's commands? And this is a thought, well, if we're naturally free and equal, we have to construct some kind of, say, as Locke puts it, an umpire, some kind of voice of public reason or something like that. So I think just you're sort of saying, oh, look, pay attention and read about the traditional Catholic theory of authority isn't really going to solve these problems. Then Alan gives a couple of reasons why coercing the baptized would be problematic. One, coercing people into the church would create an opportunity for blasphemy. As I gathered, such coercion also would give people the impression that the faithful act from terror alone. My first reply is that forcing people to remain in the church can do these things too. And also, I think the worry that I had about dignity or not really appearing in Alan's remarks here is that it also grounds the rights of the unbaptized. Dignity is the reason, one of the prime reasons that the unbaptized has rights, as Tom's read of Dignitatis Humanae maintains. Dignity is the language of the church, even if ultimately it doesn't rule out integralism. And so I think missing dignity led to Alan's claim that, it's not that burning heretics is contrary to the will of the Holy Spirit or anything silly like that, unquote. Because I think the claim here is rather simple. It's unjust to burn anyone for any reason. The will of the Holy Spirit is that we not be unjust. So it seemed to me a true claim. It's very, very important to center the idea of human dignity in the defense of religious liberty. Okay. So now I want to defend the justice argument against Tom, who I actually think is halfway to refuting it, but not all the way. Okay, so for Tom, legal authorities, he makes two claims about them, that legal authorities can and may coerce their subjects' beliefs, and then so long as subjects hold certain attitudes. Now, what I'm going to do for the sake of argument is I'm just going to grant it. I'm just going to grant it. And actually, I believe a version of it. I'm really not a Hobbesian in any respect whatsoever. So which are the attitudes that matter? What are the ones that add to the authority of legal, or the reality of legal authority? So here's a couple of things Tom says. Quote, legal direction of belief depends on those taking legal authority to be an authoritative witness. This is true of the church too. quote, our disposition to treat the state as an authoritative witness is natural, unquote. Quote, the obedience of the state's citizens standardly involves taking the state to be a credible witness for what the bonum commune requires, and an at least presumptive degree of epistemic trust in political authority is normal. It comes with human nature, unquote. Trust here is key. So it looks to me like Tom is saying that there are two necessary conditions on the existence of a legal authority. We don't have to fool with the sufficient conditions for purposes of evaluation. First, the legal authority, be it the church or the state, facilitates its subject's response to normative power, be that natural reason or the higher reason of grace. The second condition is that subjects trust the authority as an authoritative witness to truth. Now, Tom will also speak about jurisdictions, but my thought here is that we need to either show that a legal authority exists before determining its jurisdiction, or a legal authority and its real or bona fide jurisdiction are equivalent. So all the claims about jurisdiction, I think, are going to rest on claims 1 and 2 being true. So I think to refute the justice argument, Tom needs to explain why, or maybe at least through, I need an alternative or my own theory of legal authority, but at least on Tom's objection to refute the argument, Tom needs to explain how baptism meets both the first and second claim. Now, I actually think what's quite inventive about Tom's response is that baptism might well explain the first condition. The church, after baptism, facilitates our response to grace because baptism is what opens us up to it in a certain way. This is why I said I think Tom was halfway to refuting the argument. The difficulty is whether baptism can explain the second claim. Baptism has to, at least in some respects or regularly, produce the right kind of trust. And what kind of trust is this? This is the trust of the authority trust of legal authority, church or state, as an authoritative witness to truth. Now, we can all agree that baptism doesn't entail epistemic trust in legal authority. That connection is contingent. So, for instance, and of course, we'll talk about Edgardo Mortara again, because of course, what integralism session would it be if we didn't bring it up? But just consider the following case. I'm not saying anyone on the panel is committed to what actually happened. I just like using the case. So were Edgardo Mortara baptized by his nanny at the brink of death when he was an infant and raised Jewish, and Pius IX had simply not acted to remove him from his family, he would not have epistemic trust in the church as an authoritative witness to truth. In fact, this is, I think, one of the reasons that Pius IX decided to enforce Edgardo Mortara's right to a Catholic education. Precisely because the thought is that the church could not direct him towards salvation, at least not as easily, if at all. So here's what I want to say. Generalizing this point, epistemic trust can come and go post-baptism. So the church and the state might create trust through the law and baptism. I think the most interesting part of Tom's response is he could say, well, look, I mean, it's not arbitrary that people after baptism trust. And since the state can and is permitted to try to use law to communicate trust, that it can at least do something to try to keep people with the right trusting attitudes. But I still think this is pretty highly contextual. Some of you may not know, but I'm on a large Templeton grant right now studying the role of trust and norms in impoverished communities in the United States. And if we polled or worked with a variety of groups of the urban and rural poor, and what we find from many of them is that their trust in political institutions is extremely low. In fact, one of them even said, when asked, she said, I don't trust anybody but Jesus. And the thought here was that many of the people that you would think were presumptively trust authority actually don't. I do think there's good empirical evidence that people presumptively trust their parents. I actually think that's clear. But the idea in any modern state that there's a presumptive trust in, say, Washington, D.C., I don't think is empirically supported. So consider a couple of options. One I illustrated, baptized persons who, for whatever reason, find trust as such difficult, and also baptized persons identifying another body as an authoritative witness in the case of Jews or Protestants. Now, I think it's an implication of Tom's view that baptized epistemic non-trusters or mistrusters will have full religious liberty against the integralist state because the second condition of legal authority for them does not hold. They lack the relevant trust. And what that's going to mean is that the integralist state may only coerce a subset of the baptized. which is actually something in Tom's remark he allows for. So we're not actually necessarily disagreeing on that point. The trouble is maybe it's a rather small subset of people. So Tom worries, and then the interesting question here is, if integralism is a subset view, well, great. But baptism wasn't itself the moral transformer. It was its tendency to produce epistemic trust, a tendency that can be overridden in all kinds of different ways. So Tom worries that my justice argument implies the church is not a potestas at all. I don't really see that. I'm not sure why anything that I say in that chapter, and maybe there are some things I see elsewhere. For instance, in an interlude I do on the coercion argument, Augustine is where Tom takes his primary evidence. There, I actually think I was using direct coercion, I believe, in a different sense, but my footnote to Locke and Prost was misleading Tom to think I was talking about a form of direct coercion, a belief that I wasn't intending to. So I'll take responsibility for that. So I'm going to say the church can be a polity or potestas without the right of physical coercion. So long as it can make law, it has some constitutional structure, and it can use spiritual coercion, I think that suffices for the church to be a potestas. And I don't think there's anything I claim in the justice argument that requires that I say otherwise. I just don't think the argument depends on anything like a sort of Hobbesian or particularly liberal view about the relationship between coercion and belief. In fact, in the next positive project I'm doing in political theology, I'm going to be taking on a great deal of what I've learned from Tom about the natures of reason and normative power and so on. And at least thus far, I'm not sure why I can't just take all of it on. And I'm still not quite sure. So I think the justice argument survives Tom's critique because I'm not sure baptism and epistemic trust are well correlated. At least that's not been my experience in the study of trust. So those are kind of my overall remarks, but I think there's something I wanted to say more broadly, at least about my experience talking with integralists in a large variety of contexts. And this was not a tendency in Tom, but I did want to sort of explore just a final point. I think there really is a tendency to want integralism and liberalism to be somehow mutually exclusive, right? There's sort of liberalism or there's integralism. Because I think the overwhelming tendency that we see, particularly on integralists online, is to want to argue against a particular kind of liberalism. One of the whole reasons I wrote the book was to try to say, okay, well, look, enough is enough, right? You can attack liberalism all day, but what about your own view, right? Let's look at it. Let's take it seriously. And I spent a year trying to develop what I thought the best arguments for the view were. And so I guess I just think it's just going to be really, really important in the defense of integralism to not just quickly shift over to attacking liberalism. I just don't think it's very useful. It doesn't advance our understanding. And it actually makes our understanding of integralism worse because it tempts us to stretch and stretch and stretch the use of the term. So with that, those are my kind of remarks. I hope that we've been able to shed a little bit of insight here, particularly with respect to the justice argument that I think, whether it works or not, I think we've seen is pretty interesting, particularly because I think we have different accounts of the wrongness of coercing the unbaptized. And I think it would be really cool if we could figure that out. Thanks to the panel and thanks to all of you.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I'll try to create a queue. So Chris is first.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So I just to clarify, you said a couple times, and at the end there, repeated the claim that well, it's a mistake to think that integralism and liberalism are mutually exclusive. You don't mean that, right? They're obviously mutually exclusive. You mean they're not jointly exhaustive of the?
Sure, of the.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So, okay, good. Just want to make sure I was getting that right. And then I want to ask about baptism, right? I'd really like to reply to Tom's objection to your justice argument. You're worried that baptism does not entail epistemic trust in a legal authority. So let's leave adult baptism aside for a moment, because that can be more complicated. But at least it follows from pretty basic Catholic doctrine that child baptism does entail epistemic trust in legal authority, because child baptism infallibly infuses the divine virtue of faith on Catholic doctrine, right? Because there's nothing in a child that could resist that. And part of what it is to have the supernatural virtue of faith is to recognize and trust in the relevant ecclesiastical authority. And so, at least in the case of child baptism, it's not contingent. And then I'm wondering, does that fix the problem? Yeah.
Okay, great. So when I think about the supernatural virtue of faith being infused, I don't see it attached to a particular authority. I think it's something more like a disposition. But that disposition doesn't have to unfold in any particular way. You're not getting to the epistemic trust in a particular authority, taking a particular authority to be an authoritative witness to the truth. Are you thinking, well, I won't, just my thought here is that the faith that's infused is pretty underspecified and contingent. So, I mean, are you saying the supernatural virtue of faith entails, for instance, that an infant trusts in, say, papal infallibility or something like that?
Yes.
Oh, well, that seems wrong to me.
I mean, right, sure. So, but if it turns out that the Catholics are right about this, then like, does Tom's objection to your justice argument then go through on that assumption?
On the assumption that baptism entails the attitude even in infants,
Yeah.
and that you have the relevant level of epistemic trust? I guess so. I had to think more about it.
Good. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to stop people asking questions. I've got that response to.
Yeah, Brian. So my question is for Kevin. I know that in the last year or so, a particular Irish politician was opposed to infant baptism on the very grounds that it would be coercive to the child, much like circumcision would. It would not give the child a choice. And I wonder why you think that baptism itself is not contrary to the dignity of the child.
I'm not sure what I said would lead one to think it was contrary to the dignity of the child. I mean, there's this case, I mean, the worry is about them being coerced in a way that their will would oppose. So I thought that the case of infant baptism is just they don't have attitudes one way or the other.
But it is coercive in a sense. It's making the choice for them. So why are you not?
Why? I don't think it counts as coercion in that case unless you have a set of options before you that you recognize are in some way limited. Yeah.
Why wouldn't you then object to, say I became an American citizen, actually my children are all American citizens anyway, my wife's American, but say she wasn't, and I became an American citizen, all my children became American citizens, all but one of them under the age of reason, so they all instantaneously acquire all these obligations enforceable by death in some cases to the United States of America, which I've just elected for them, and which they can't get out of, because if they commit treason against the USA will pursue them across the world, even if they acquire Liechtensteinian citizenship or whatever. So I don't see how that's not precisely analogous to the situation you're objecting to.
The way that I took it to work out in Tom's condition is that he was thinking that the epistemic trust in the state was somehow natural. And so I was just trying to argue against the idea that these trust attitudes are, at least for large institutions, natural.
Yeah, I mean, there are going to be situations where people lack trust in the state. As I said, revolutions happen.
Yep.
That's when virtually everyone has lost trust in the state, and it's just relying on physical force to keep people down, and that's not usually enough. It's very hard for a state to enforce the law in a way that's effective and tolerable, and even into the medium term, without relying on instilling a fair amount of conviction as to the values behind its laws, in a sufficient number of the population. If you're just relying on fear of the sanctions, it's going to get very expensive and very ineffective fast. But you're right that there are radical changes over time, not just in who trusts the state, but what people trust states about. So, for example, in early modern Europe, people trusted the state as a religious witness. That's why rulers like Elizabeth I or the Austrian Habsburgs used their authority to change the religion of their country. You couldn't do that now, but you can be trusted, perhaps because of your association with medical elites, to impose for the common good such draconian laws that people willingly obey laws forbidding them to see their dying relations in hospital. Actually, I suspect some early modern states would have done that much harder. So there's a real problem here about variation in trust that doesn't undermine the fact that trust is a fundamental element in our relation to political authority. The other point I want to make is, you're absolutely right that you can be baptized and not trust the church. Lots of Protestants are baptized validly and they don't trust the apostles of the church. We all know that. Two things to say. One is that, of course, sometimes the lack of trust, which is a lack of belief in an aspect of revelation, can be culpable. One very important feature of this, if you're having obligations on belief, you are committed to a metaphysics of belief as a free act, which brings a possibility of moral responsibility for what you believe. So you can cease to trust in the church while baptized through your own fault, and then you can be justly punished. The punishment won't necessarily directly change your views or attitudes, but it will serve as a very good messaging example to the rest of the ecclesial community and can be justified on that basis. Just as you can punish a criminal under the law of the state who no longer trusts the state as an authority to send a message to everyone else about how theft is very seriously wrong. Now, of course, in many cases, lack of trust in the church is very plausibly non-culpable. And one of the very interesting features in the history of ecclesial theology is the growing realization through the 18th and 19th centuries, through reference to terms like invincible ignorance, an awful lot of the validly baptized really aren't to blame. They are completely detached from the potestas, the church as a legal authority, and must be treated accordingly. And I don't think that is going to be an objection to the theory of the authority of the church as relying, as being about legally directed belief, and when it succeeds in doing that, as dependent on supernaturally instilled trust. It's just, I quite agree, it can often be lacking. And the church has had to start dealing pastorally with that. I could go on, but
Sure.
Oh, sorry, you want to respond?
I'll try to go briefly, although that's difficult. So I don't think COVID is a great example of trust beyond a pretty small period of time. I think if anything, it's been a trust busting event. But this business about the lack of trust being culpable, I think, is really important. And I think where Tom and I agree is that that's going to make the punishment of the baptized, or the relevant punishment of the baptized, a subset, right? Those eligible for punishment or a subset of the baptized. And that, I take it, is actually much more congenial to something that, at least this may surprise you, that I would be willing to agree to. Where if you could really genuinely hold people responsible for not trusting the church, then I can imagine circumstances in which coercion to them would be justified. But actually, this is also true for John Rawls. So I'm not sure if we're kind of in integralist territory, because even in that case, I think the coercion would be, as we say, publicly justified in person. So then I'm not sure. I think we might be in the vicinity of a liberal, I mean, not a Rawlsian, but of a kind of liberalism, de facto, if not.
I think Rawls at one stage does, in the theory of justice, say that liberty of conscience is limited by the requirements of just order.
And here I'm thinking.
So I think there are elements in liberal thought that do take seriously the idea of coercive regulation of something like conscience.
Sure. Okay, so we come together a bit.
Yeah, so I'm gonna let Father Rennie comment since we've had our say a little bit more than he has.
Take real quick,
Really small?
real quick, yeah,
Promise?
yes.
Okay, go.
So Kevin, and I like, so Tom's response is great. Alan's response, as you know, I've been that kind of God gives authority view in my work. You have like an epistemic problem that I was just gonna say, like a particularist isn't gonna be bothered by that at all. They're just gonna say it's obvious in some cases that people have legitimate authority, and we should judge any epistemic theory based on that obviousness. And given that God exists and has guided our cognitive faculties to be reliable, then we can maybe even say there's some reliability in the consensus of the populace whenever there's going to be some sort of agreement about who's an authority. It won't be infallible, but it could be as a heuristic. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I just think when you're asking the state to detect attitudes in tens of millions of people, that its own fallibility here is going to be extraordinary. Invincible ignorance, for all we know, could be everywhere. The state doesn't have to just judge whether someone's trusting or not. It has to determine whether trust is culpable or not, or distrust is culpable or not. That's a lot of judgments about people's attitudes in order to show that they're under the relevant authority.
Father Rennie.
So this is sort of for Kevin and everyone else, a little bit of a general thought, which was, I talked with Kevin about the justice argument before a lot.
You're gonna raise your
because
objection?
I
You got
have
like four of them.
Well, I had objections to it, but I was thinking of repairing it. And I mentioned to you, I thought sort of the thing that I thought was sort of the upshot of the justice argument. One way of thinking about it is baptism maybe is a moral difference maker for spiritual coercion, but it's disproportionate. It does not justify civil coercion. So I thought that was like maybe one way to fix the argument. There might be some sort of disproportionality. But actually, I think there's a better version. You gave me an insight when I was listening, which is, I don't know about the integralist panelists, but it seems to me, I'll throw this out there, one might think there is a problem with a violation of natural justice, human dignity, with countries prohibiting exit. So, for example, Alan said, my children, after I make them American citizens, can't leave. Now they're going to be under penalty of death for treason. Well, they can leave. U.S. law allows them to change their citizenship, to leave, to go away, right? And there are countries, though, that don't. I'm not going to tell you which one. But the USSR did this, right? Prohibited under penalty of death. People for leaving. My family came from communist Hungary and under penalty of death escaped. I think that's unjust. I hope we agree this is unjust. But what you might think is if you agree that's unjust, that's exactly the justice argument, is why should baptism alone constitute, for example, a certain kind of penalty for exit that we might think is unjust, right? Why should human dignity be so overridden by the good of baptism, for example, that exiting the church ought to be prohibited by physical penalty, civil penalty to some extent? I mean, there might be some penalty. Let's imagine, right? I'm married and I break the marriage bond and the state can penalize me, right? And there might be some reasonable penalty, but you might think there are penalties that are not reasonable, right? And the fact of baptism is not, in that case, just what entails culpability. If we think culpability is what makes it the case, it's not the fact of baptism that entails culpability. It's some relation to faith and agreement to the faith and being able to understand the faith. So, for example, if I go into the maternity ward and use a super soak, say, I baptize you, right? You get everything, right? Those people don't become culpable for penalties of exit, is what you might think. So I think this is the justice argument, is baptism doesn't entail the right facts about penalty of exit, apart from perhaps spiritual penalties.
I actually give this to Kevin, but we do have one minute.
I'll just take that on. I think the issue of freedom of exit from an integralist polity has been really underexplored. And it's really important to get it right, because if those under the authority of the church authorized state can just immigrate, you might think they'd empty out.
I just say that if you commit treason against the United States of America and then you move abroad and you renounce your citizenship and the country on whose behalf you committed treason gives you citizenship, the United States of America does not automatically pardon you for the treasonable act which you committed while you were a citizen of the United States of America. So the analogy was, it doesn't follow in that sense. Lord Haw couldn't have just said the British government, he was a collaborator with the Nazis, but it's okay, Germany gave me citizenship and I renounced my British citizenship, so I'm afraid you can't come after me after all. So in that sense, that the analogy doesn't follow.